Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to discuss Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 28th of September 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. Before we jump into the discussion, let us first look at few of the statements which you have to find out yourself whether they are true or false. Of course, the answers to each one of them have been given at the end of the discussion. Herd immunity or community immunity occurs when more than 50% of the community is immune to a disease. Mr. Jaswant Singh held the position of Finance, Defence and External Affairs Minister in the Union government. Why I Am an Atheist was written by Chandrasekhar Azad. Bhagat Singh wrote for Kirti, the journal of the Kirti Kisan Party or Workers and Peasants Party. Carbon leaking is the process through which carbon dioxide reaches into space. Real GDP is calculated by using the current market prices. According to the Constitution of India, the Chief Justice of India is the master of a roster in the Supreme Court. Sandalwood spike disease is a fungi. A carbon tax is a fee imposed on businesses and individuals that works as a sort of pollution tax. Let us now begin the discussion. Shaheed Bhagat Singh. Although there is no news item today in the newspaper, but an advertisement put up by the Punjab government on page number 2 of Delhi edition of today's The Hindu newspaper is an advertisement on 113th birth anniversary of Shaheed-e-Azam Sardar Bhagat Singh Ji. From an aspirant point of view, this topic becomes extremely important both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains examination, as questions related to India's struggle for independence are frequently asked. But not just that. As a citizen of India enjoying the independence, it is important to know and be aware of the lives of the peoples who laid their lives for India's independence. And the role played by Shaheed Bhagat Singh can never be overemphasized. And hence in this regard, we will first understand the context in which the revolutionaries rose up in India, especially in 1920s. Then we will discuss other causes behind rise in revolutionary movement across the country and the two main regions where it emerged. Then we will discuss an important organization which organized all the revolutionaries in North India and the acts of bravery committed by this particular group and its members, among which Shaheed Bhagat Singh was also a part. And finally, we will discuss few important things about Shaheed Bhagat Singh. So let us first understand the background in which the revolutionary activism or the resort to violent measures to achieve the goal of independence emerged, especially in post-World War I era. So we know that revolutionary terrorists were severely suppressed during World War I, with most of their leaders in jail or absconding. Consequently, in order to create a more harmonious and peaceful atmosphere for the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, the British government released most of the revolutionaries under a general amnesty in early 1920s. Also at the same time, National Congress launched non-cooperation movement, and Gandhi ji, along with many other Congress leaders, requested the revolutionaries to not take up violent measures to create a unanimous non-violent movement across the country. And hence, during that period of time, revolutionaries either joined the movement led by Gandhiji or they suspended their activities even though they did not agree with the non-violent movement. But since they also wanted to achieve independence for India, they thought it is not a big harm to wait for few months or years. But the sudden suspension of non-cooperation movement shattered the high hopes raised earlier by Congress. Many young people were left frustrated and they started questioning both national leadership as well as their strategy of non-violent measures to achieve the goal of independence. And many were drawn to the idea that violent methods alone would free India. and hence began the second phase of revolutionary movement across the country. But it was mainly concentrated in two major parts of India at that point of time. One was concentrated in Punjab, Haryana, and northwestern parts of India. Of course, the map of India didn't look like this at that point of time. And the second was in Bengal. So, from the perspective of mains and prelims examination, it is important for us to understand what were the causes behind rise in revolutionary movements. And we just discussed the failure of non-cooperation movement and the failure of non-violent strategy adopted by Congress and Gandhiji, and emphasized by Gandhiji, was one of the most important reasons, but there were other reasons as well. As we know that younger people of the age of 20 and 30s were left frustrated because of the multiple failures of non-violent movements. And at the same time, they came under the influence of several new social forces. And one of them was a surge of working class trade unionism after World War I. And they could see the revolutionary potential of the new class which was coming up in the towns which were set up by Britishers. For example, in Bombay, Calcutta, as well as in Madras. And they thought that the united social force of these upcoming new social classes could be utilized to gain independence. But at the same time, the success of Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, mesmerized people across the world, especially against the imperialism. And the young people, motivated for independence, were keen to learn from and take the help of young Soviet state and its ruling Bolshevik party. And at the same time, a lot of new groups had cropped up across the country which called themselves communist groups, and they committed themselves to the idea of Marxism, socialism, or proletarianism. So these four factors led to the emergence of new wave of revolutionary violence in our country. And as we have discussed, two strands of revolutionaries began to appear since 1920s. One was in Bengal and another one was in northwestern region of our country. And now we are going to focus on revolutionaries of North India, because they were first to emerge out of the mood of frustration and organized under the leadership of old veterans Ram Prasad Bismil, Jogesh Chatterjee, and Sachindranath Sanyal. They met in Kanpur in 1924 and established Hindustan Republican Association. They also put out a manifesto. They committed themselves to organize armed revolution to overthrow colonial rule, but they were not limited to just that. After overthrowing British rule, they committed themselves to establish on its place Federal Republic of United States of India. So you can see that even in 1920 and 24, our revolutionary leaders were just not people with guns in their hands, they were academicians as well. And you can see the foresight in their thinking that even at that time, they committed themselves to the establishment of federalism of states, something similar to United States of America. If we talk about the major actions being committed by them, one can never fail to mention Kakori robbery, which was carried out in 1925. Let us know in the comment section what you know about Kakori Kand or Kakori robbery. So as a consequence of Kakori robbery, the government reaction was of course quick and harsh. It arrested a large number of young men and tried them in Kakori conspiracy case. Of course, Ashfaqullah Khan, Ram Prasad Bismil, Roshan Singh and Rajendra Lahiri were hanged, and many others were sent to Andamans for life imprisonment, and Azad, justifying his name, remained at large, who later on laid the foundations of Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. Although Kakori case was a major setback to the revolutionaries of northern India, but it was not a fatal blow. Younger men such as Bijay Kumar Sinha, Shiv Varma and Jaydev Kapoor, along with Bhagat Singh and Sukhdev, reorganized Hindustan Republican Association into Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. So now you can see the increasing influence of the ideas of Marxism and socialism in India's independence movement, so that HRA was reorganized as HSRA. This reorganization was conducted in 1928. Now, The reorganization led to a change in thinking, and they committed themselves towards a mass action and mass revolution, and not conducting few murders here and there, assassinations and robbery. They decided to do something like the Bolsheviks. They decided to move away from individual heroic action, which was the trademark of Indian independence movement till that time. But a sudden death of Lala Ji or Lala Rajpat Rai as a result of brutal lathi charge when he was leading an anti-Simon Commission demonstration at Lahore on October 30th, 1928 led them once again to take to individual assassination. The death of this great Punjabi leader, popularly known as Sher-e Punjab, was seen by youthful leadership of Hindustan Socialist Republican Association as a direct challenge, and hence they assassinated Sanders. Three people who assassinated Sanders were Bhagat Singh, Azad and Rajguru. After assassinating Sanders, HSRA did not hide itself into oblivion, but rather they not only claimed the crime, but they also put up posters justifying the murder of Sanders. And here starts the fearless and valiant act committed by Bhagat Singh along with B.K. Dutt, who instead of fleeing decided to step up the game. They thought that the time for revolution had come and it is time that people should be organized, they should know about how to achieve independence, and it's time to create the mass awareness. And what better way to create mass awareness than to bomb Central Legislative Assembly, at that time highest legislative body of British India. So Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt were asked to throw a bomb in Central Legislative Assembly on 8th of April 1929, and the event which was chosen was also quite relevant. British government had decided to pass Public Safety and Trade Dispute Bill, which would reduce the civil liberties of citizens in general and workers in particular. And while the discussion for this particular bill was going on, they threw bomb inside Central Legislative Assembly. Now, you should know that the bomb was harmless and it didn't hurt anyone. But the aim was not to kill, for the bombs were relatively harmless. But just as they detonated the bomb, they threw many pamphlets inside the assembly halls proclaiming this act has been committed to make the deaf hear. Now, as a normal citizen, one would ask, what was the purpose of committing such an act which didn't kill any Britishers and of course did not lead to any stoppage of the passage of this particular bill? Because the idea was to get arrested. And once you get arrested, of course, the government is going to put you on trial and to use the trials as the propaganda, because then trials and whatever you say in those trials shall be published across the country. People will read them and it will create mass awareness with respect to what Britishers are doing, how we can achieve independence. And so the trials started. Their fearless and defiant attitude in the courts, because whenever they started to enter into the courts, they started shouting slogans like Inqilab Zindabad, down with imperialism, Sarfaroshi ki tamanna ab hamare dil mein hai, Mera rang de basanti chola. All these slogans became famous only because of Bhagat Singh and others who were put on trial. Of course, on 23rd March 1923, Bhagat Singh was hanged till death. So now you can understand that a person who had full opportunity to evade arrest and detention and consequent hanging chose to embrace news, and that was Bhagat Singh Ji. Now, more often than not, whenever we think about these people who took up arms, we think them as a people who are violent or they are more interested in crimes. But the peculiar case of Bhagat Singh is such that if you analyze his whole life, he turns out to be an academician par excellence, because since his teenage times and especially in early adulthood, wherever he stayed, his first job was to organize the local youth into study circles and circulate books, especially dealing with Marxism, communism and various independence movements, and he also set up various libraries in Lahore and in Kanpur. So he was an academician first, and he wrote a very interesting book, Why I Am an Atheist. You must read this book if you have time, which is an essay justifying his whole philosophy towards religion. When you read this book, you will realize the intellectual depth in the thinking of Shahid Bhagat Singh. One of his famous quotes is, "Bombs and pistols do not make a revolution. The sword of a revolution is sharpened on the whetting stone of ideas." So this one statement I have chosen to put here is summary of whole life of Bhagat Singh. People remember him as revolutionary, as a person who took up arms against the British, but it is more important for us to appreciate the intellectual Bhagat Singh. And just from the perspective of prelims examination, he was member of course, Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, and he also helped establishment of Punjab Naujawan Bharat Sabha in 1926. So from the perspective of prelims examination, dates and associations and books are important, but from the perspective of mains examination, it is important for us to keep in mind the causes behind rise in revolutionary movement across India, especially in post-World War I and after the failure of non-cooperation movement led by Gandhiji. Let's now move on to the next news. This next news item appears on page number 7, the benefits of carbon tax. Here the author lays emphasis on pricing the carbon content of not only the domestic production but also the imports. According to author, both are very important, and hence in this context, it is important for us to understand why we need to reduce carbon emissions. What is so urgent about this particular matter, so that countries across the world have committed themselves in Paris Climate Deal to reduce emissions. Then we will look into two of the ways in which the carbon emissions can be reduced, and then why such a step leads to carbon leaking, what is carbon leaking, and how we can counter that as well. This particular topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of environment, which gets covered both in prelims as well as mains examination. Now, to understand the need for cutting emissions, we need to carefully look at this particular graph which is on your screen. On the y-axis, you have global greenhouse gas emissions, and on the x-axis you have the timeline starting from 1990 to 2100. The line shown in black color, which is this line, is the current trend of carbon emissions, and you can see that how it is increasing every year. And so if we project the current emission rate into the future, it seems like that we are going to end up somewhere around in this range by 2100. So if no action is taken across the world, and if the emissions continue to grow at this particular rate, in 2100 the emissions across the globe will be in this particular range, which will be around 3 times the current emissions. So current emissions is around 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. In 2100 it will be around 150 to 100 in this range, and that will cause a temperature increase of 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius on an average. So that means if we continue with the current emission trends, the temperature change or the global warming across the world will be around 5 degrees Celsius, and that is not sustainable. And this particular projection of warming is extremely scary, and that is why the countries committed themselves on a voluntary basis to cut down emissions. What they committed has come to be known as nationally determined contribution. They promised that they are not going to continue in this particular fashion, but they are going to cut the emissions successively, and that is what you see in the blue shaded region. So the countries promised under the Paris Climate Deal to cut the emissions. And if we take into account their promises, if we believe that their promises are going to be true, and if we believe that countries are going to abide by whatever they have committed, then in 2100, we are expecting a temperature rise of around 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius. So even when the countries have committed themselves to reducing the carbon dioxide emission, we are going to have global warming, but of course it will be half as worse as if there are no commitments. But still there shall be a warming and 2.5-2.8 degrees Celsius of warming. But if we want to contain the temperature rise to within 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need further actions. And whatever the countries have promised in Paris Climate Deal shall not be sufficient, and they will have to do even more, and this is what is known as enhanced action. This was one of the agendas of Conference of Parties 25 held at Madrid in 2019. So now we can understand that why it is important to reduce and drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And whatever the countries have promised is good, but not good enough. And hence, action is required. So out of all the options available, two are often most cited. One is to allow emissions trading, and the second one is to impose the carbon tax. So it is important for us to understand what exactly emissions trading is and how it is going to affect the overall carbon dioxide emissions, and we will also look into what are the merits written in green color and demerits written in red color. So emission trading is a process through which a maximum amount of allowable effluents or emissions from an industry are capped, and then those companies emitting less emissions are allowed to sell their extra carbon credits. So let us just understand this with an example. So there are two companies, A and B, and the cap on their emissions have been set. So let's say that the circle denotes the amount of carbon dioxide they can emit. And let's say that the company A ends up emitting more carbon dioxide than the capped amount, whereas company B did some changes in its management, in its production process, and contained its carbon dioxide emissions to the half of the capped amount. And now you can see that they were able to save a lot of carbon dioxide, and hence whatever extra they have becomes carbon credits. Now if A wants to breach the capped carbon dioxide emissions amount, it will have to purchase equivalent carbon credits from other companies. And before purchasing the carbon credits, they cannot exceed the capped amount. Before exceeding the capped carbon dioxide emissions, A will have to approach B, C and various other companies, gather so many carbon credits as they are exceeding, and then they can breach the limit. How it will reduce carbon emissions, you will ask? Now, if it is imposed, then A will think about making changes, otherwise they will have to shell out extra currencies and money to buy those carbon credits, and at the same time it will incentivize other companies to innovate to reduce carbon dioxide emissions so that they can earn extra revenue. And hence it is very effective in bringing down overall emissions, and it also helps in innovation in the industries. But it is easier said than done. There are issues here as well. Mega industries, which are major polluters, it has been seen never bother about making reforms or amends in their emission process, and they simply buy out credits from other greener industries. And at the same time, for a country like India, it is also difficult to calculate the emissions because a lot of emissions come from informal sector or from small scale industries, and hence it is very difficult to keep track of their emissions. And also it is very difficult to develop a market, just like a market for groceries, market for insurance. It is very difficult to create a market in carbon trading because this is going to be a new mechanism, and carbon credit is going to be a new commodity or services which will be exchanged. It will be a lot of time before the prices of the carbon credits can be stabilized, and hence until that time government will have to intervene in the determination of the prices of the carbon credits, and it will be very difficult task to achieve at a unanimous agreements among the industries and their major stakeholders as to what shall be the price of the carbon. So one way to cut down the carbon emissions is to allow emissions trading. Next way is to impose carbon tax. Emissions trading is an indirect way of controlling emissions, but carbon tax and imposition of carbon tax is quite direct. A carbon tax is a specific tax on consumption of goods which cause carbon dioxide emissions. So for example, imposing an extra tax on use of coal or petroleum, and Government of India has also imposed a tax on coal, and that is the carbon tax. Various other countries have also resorted to imposition of carbon tax on major polluter industries. You use carbon, you pay for it beforehand. And so whatever the consumption is of that particular product will be reflective of the cost on environment. If you use something which has led to emission of carbon dioxide, you are going to pay for it and pay more for it. And hence, it internalizes the negative externality of a particular good or service. So externality is a cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. And negative externality is obviously a cost. So if an industry is producing something which is leading to a lot of emissions of carbon dioxide, then that company should pay for it. And what better way to make them pay than to make their products dearer or expensive? So let's say if you are consuming a good A and a lot of carbon dioxide is emitted while the manufacturing of A goes on, then the government imposes a particular tax or a carbon tax and inflates its prices. Of course, it is expected that the demand for product A shall decline, and hence the company which is producing a good A shall be forced to adopt cleaner measures. And hence it pushes the firms to develop cleaner products or the products which do not lead to a lot of emissions. And apart from that, it raises the government revenues because after all the carbon tax is collected by the government, and that fund is utilized in taking climate actions, taking various measures which make the overall country greener. But again, just like carbon trading, imposition of carbon tax also has few issues. And again, it can be difficult to measure how much carbon is produced by which industry, and therefore difficult to know what level of carbon tax to be imposed. Then of course, it is difficult to know the true cost of carbon emissions on the environment as well as on the future generations. And hence, one can always argue as to what should be the appropriate level of taxation. For example, imposing 400 rupees of carbon tax on per ton of coal can be argued to be very less by environmentalists because they will then cite the negative consequences of emissions from carbon dioxide. But it will be cited as very high by industrialists because then it deters industrial growth. So all those countries which impose a sizable amount of carbon tax on their industries or polluting industries have seen decline of industrial activity because production, especially production of polluting goods, shifts to other countries, because you should know that not all countries in the world have imposed either emissions trading or carbon tax, and hence whenever a particular country takes a proper steps towards greening or reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, the industrial growth in that particular country declines, and that is what is known as carbon leaking. So carbon leaking refers to a situation that may occur if, for reasons of costs related to climate policies, businesses transfer their production to other countries with lower emission norms. So for example, there is a jurisdiction, let's say European Union. We know that their emission norms are very tight and they impose a lot of taxes to polluting industries, because of which the manufacturing shifts either to India or to Africa. Now the problem with that is not only these countries do not have proper emission norms, but the regulations are also very lax. And so this leaking leads to increase in overall emissions, because then companies operate from jurisdictions like China and India which do not have stricter regulations, and then there is a decline in industrial activity in European Union, but there is an increase in overall emissions across the globe, and hence one of the ways suggested by the author is to impose carbon border taxes, which has been recently applied by European Union as well. Now what is carbon border tax? So carbon border tax is like a duty levied on all the products which are coming from those countries which do not have emission norms. So if a product is being manufactured in a country where the emission norms are lax, and if that product is being imported in European Union, then European Union is going to levy the same carbon tax as it was levied on the companies manufacturing inside European Union. So what this will do? First and foremost, it will increase the reduction of emissions. So if a company feels that just by migrating to another manufacturing location, they can escape the European Union taxation laws, their incentives have been taken away, and at the same time their incentive for transfer of manufacturing from European Union have also been taken away. Because wherever they will go, if they want to sell their product in European Union, it will cost the same. And hence author also suggests that we have so far imposed carbon tax on domestic industries, but it is time now that such a tax should be imposed on imported goods as well. Otherwise, the domestic companies shall be put at huge disadvantage. So from the perspective of prelims examination, it is important to keep in mind this particular graph, emissions trading, carbon taxation and how they act. From the perspective of mains examination, it is important to keep in mind the merits and demerits of both emissions trading as well as carbon tax, and what is carbon leaking and how we can counter that by imposition of carbon border tax. Growth compulsions fiscal arithmetic appears on page number 6. This article has been written by former RBI Governor Mr. Rangarajan. This article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of economic contraction in the first quarter of 2021 and accordingly discusses as to what the government should do in order to kickstart economy and to put it on high growth trajectory. So in this regard, we will understand the arguments of the author, and then we will delve into the basics of GDP, understanding real versus nominal GDP. So we all know that there has been a slowdown in an economy. But how do we know that? So according to a recent report published by National Statistical Office or NSO, the GDP has contracted by around 24% in first quarter of 2021 as compared to 5% growth registered in first quarter of 2019-20 fiscal year. The scale of contraction can be gauged from the fact that it is for the first time that India has recorded contraction in the quarterly GDP since it started publishing GDP data on a quarterly basis since 1996. Also, India has seen contraction in GDP for the first time in last 41 years. That is since 1979. So whatever is happening in India's economy is unprecedented, and obviously which has led to increasing or the ballooning of our fiscal deficit, which has of course as expected has increased a lot post the economic slowdown in 2021. Before going into the argument, let us first understand what fiscal deficit is, and if broadly speaking, it is total expenditure minus total revenues, and there's a star sign in revenue because it does not takes into account debt generating revenues. So you should let us know in the comment section why we have put up a star sign over here. But generally, if you're a beginner, you should understand that whatever government spends, if you subtract from that whatever government earns, is the deficit which needs to be funded. And generally the government of India has been running a fiscal deficit since many years. The government of India wants to reduce the fiscal deficit because high fiscal deficit is not only bad for economy but also for various other reasons. So there are two ways in which you can increase the fiscal deficit. Either you increase this particular number. For example, if the government spends more, of course, the deficit will increase. But another way you can increase the deficit is by reduction of total revenues. And in this particular year, due to economic slowdown, the revenues of the government, both tax as well as non-tax revenues, have reduced a lot. Because if the economy is contracting, of course, the revenue which the government gets also contracts significantly. And hence, in 2020 and 21, the major cause of increasing fiscal deficit has been the reduction in tax and non-tax revenues. But government wants to contain fiscal deficit. Now, if the revenues are falling, so if the income of the government is falling, the only way it can contain the fiscal deficit is to reduce the total expenditure as well. And this is what government has done. It has curtailed the expenses. And when government curtails the expenditure, it leads to disastrous impact on the society, economy, everything. Because government is a major spender in economy, it also provides for welfare of vulnerable sections, and hence when it decides to lower the expenditure, it leads to long-term adverse impacts. And hence in this regard, author suggests monetization of the government debt. So author suggests that government should not reduce the expenses, but rather the government should increase the expenditure and not worry about the fiscal deficit. Coming from an ex-RBI governor, we should pay attention to this argument. Mr. Rangarajan says that government, instead of worrying about the fiscal deficit, should increase the expenditure to bring the economy on track. But when we talk about from where to meet this increased expenses, the government should monetize its government debt. Now, what does monetization of the government debt means? Now, if the government has fiscal deficit, this means that government needs to borrow. Now there are two sources from where the government can borrow. One of them is market and another one is from RBI. And monetization of the debt means that the government should borrow from RBI, leaving the market alone. And there is a particular reason why the government should not borrow from the market. Now you should understand that market has a limited capacity, denoted by this particular circle, to finance debt. In the market, not just the government, but also the private players go in order to finance their debt. But the problem is that as soon as the government goes for the loans to the market, majority of the loan is given to the government because government is very reliable, and most of the people who have money would prefer to lend to the government rather than giving loan to the private sector, and this effect is known as crowding out of the private sector. What this does is that it curtails the ability of the private sector to fund their own initiatives, and that is why Mr. Rangarajan wants government to monetize its debt, which means to issue the bonds directly to RBI, which will fund the debt of the government. Since a lot of viewers of DNS are very new and beginners, we make it a point that we keep on discussing basic concepts from time to time, and it's time for us to discuss real versus nominal GDP. But before that, let us understand what GDP is. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So in an economy, if there are two kinds of products, let's say A and B, which are priced at 10 rupees and 5 rupees each, and let's say there are 2 units of A being built and 3 units of B being built, so the size of the GDP will be 35 rupees, but it is not as simple as that. There are two ways in which you can do it. And that is what is the concept of real versus nominal GDP. Let us understand them. So a real GDP is calculated by using the base year prices. So let's say that for calculation of GDP, the base year is 2011 and 12. And in 2011 and 12, 10 quantity of a particular product A was manufactured and the price was 5 rupees. And let's say we want to calculate the size of the GDP in 2017 and 18. Of course, it is expected that the quantity being produced of that particular good would have increased. So let's say that it has increased to 20 rupees. And in 2017 and 18, the prices have also increased, right? Now, real GDP is calculated by using the current quantity but older prices. So the current quantity of production is 20 rupees, but the prices will be taken as that of base year, and hence the size of GDP comes out to be 100 rupees. And let's say in 2018 and 19 fiscal year, which means that very next year, the quantity has increased from 20 to 30 and the prices have also increased to 15. But for calculation of real GDP, we are again going to multiply the quantity by 5, which is the prices in the base year. So you can see that the real GDP has changed from 100 to 150, and this shows the real GDP growth rate of 50%. Now you might be wondering why we are keeping the prices constant. Now we are keeping the prices constant because we want to differentiate, or we want to know that whether the increment in the GDP each year is happening due to the prices or due to actual increase in production. And that is what nominal GDP is, which is calculated by using the current market prices. So in this particular example, if we want to calculate the nominal GDP of the economy in 2017 and 18, we will multiply the current quantity with the current prices, giving us the nominal GDP of 200 as opposed to real GDP of 100. And if we want to see the increase, we will calculate the nominal GDP in 2018-19 by multiplying 30 with 15, giving 450 as the GDP of the economy, showing 125% growth. So you can see that real GDP growth in the same period was 50, whereas nominal GDP growth came out to be 125%. So if we just calculate the nominal GDP and if we look at the data, we will be mesmerized by the growth rate of a particular economy. But if you see, the production has not increased by that much. It is the impact of the prices which is actually making it look like GDP has progressed a lot. But if you look at the overall production, it is reflected in the real GDP because we remove the factor of the prices from there. And that is where the role of GDP deflator comes into play. GDP deflator is nominal GDP divided by real GDP, which measures the increase in prices of goods and services in the current year as compared to the base year. And it is considered as indicator of inflation. So these are the few static portions, basic concepts which are much needed from the perspective of prelims examination. India is still far from herd immunity, says Vardhan, appears on page number 1. Union Health Minister Harsh Vardhan on Sunday cautioned that Indian Council of Medical Research's first COVID-19 sero survey should not create a sense of complacency among the people with regard to the virus. Now, ICMR has been conducting sero surveys every month since last 3 to 4 months, and if you are following our DNS, you must have seen the reports. More than 35 to 40% of the people in Delhi and Mumbai have been found to contain antibodies against coronavirus. And hence, a lot of people have suggested that India indeed is moving towards achievement of herd immunity. And that is what our health minister has said is not true. Now, since everyone is talking about herd immunity, let us just quickly go over to this concept. But before that, let us understand what immunity is. So in biology, immunity is the capability of an organism to resist harmful microorganisms like bacteria, viruses, and many others. It is believed that once a person is infected, they develop an immunity against that. Of course, it might not be lifelong, but it provides resistance for some time to come. What happens when a novel pathogen or a new virus like coronavirus comes into the scene? Since it is a novel virus or a new virus, there is no resistance or no immunity against it. And hence the virus quickly spreads across the community. And so we have a demonstration for you on your screen. On the left hand side, you see that if no one is immune in a particular population against a coronavirus or any other new virus, the infection goes on unabated without any control because there is no antibody in anyone. And so, if an infected person meets with 4 people, he or she ends up infecting most of them. But this gradually leads to a condition where around 50 to 60% of the people in a particular population are infected with that particular virus or a bacteria. When most of a population is immune to an infectious disease, this provides an indirect protection of herd immunity, even to those people who are not immune to the disease. So, if I do not have antibody against a particular virus, but I live in a society where most people are immune, I don't need to worry. For example, if 80% of people are immune to a virus, 4 out of every 5 people who encounter someone with the disease won't get sick, as you can see on the right hand side of the demonstration. In this way, the spread of infectious disease is kept under control. And depending on how contagious an infection is, usually 50 to 80% of the population needs immunity to achieve herd immunity. And that is what Dr. Harsh Vardhan says, that merely infecting 30 to 40% of the people in a society is not a criteria for herd immunity, and it depends on the virus. Now the question arises, how do we achieve herd immunity? And there are 2 ways to achieve that. Either more and more number of people get infected with the virus and achieve immunity, or with the development of vaccine, we vaccinate enough number of people in the society so that they get antibodies. And you should keep in mind that vaccination is a way to achieve herd immunity. So this is a very simple concept of herd immunity which needs to be kept in mind. Where is the sentinel guarding our rights is in lead editorial, appears on page number 6. In this particular article, author has highlighted few of the concerns and issues which he thinks is currently plaguing the Supreme Court. Now, before we start to discuss the issues raised by the author, we would like to make it clear that all these opinions have been taken directly from the article, and they do not reflect the views of Rao's IAS Study Circle. So before we go into the discussion, let us first understand the meaning of the word sentinel. So sentinel means a soldier or a guard whose job is to stand and keep a watch. And if you read the Constitution of India, that is what the idea behind the creation of such a powerful and independent Supreme Court is. It is a protector of not just our fundamental rights, but also through the doctrine of basic structure of the Constitution, it also protects Constitution from unwanted amendments. At the same time, it is also the apex court in the country. And hence, the functioning of Supreme Court is very, very important. And in this regard, author highlights three major issues. The first issue is the exercise of power, especially by the Chief Justice. Now, according to the author, power must be exercised by court in manner that in the public gaze or in public opinion appears as the protector of the Constitution. The functioning of the Supreme Court should be such that people should actually consider it as a protector of Constitution. But on contrary to that, the Supreme Court upheld the Chief Justice as the master of the roster, and that judgment was much debated. And utilizing this particular judgment, Chief Justices have used this power to constitute benches and allocate cases to such benches which appears to be highly selective. So Master of the Roster refers to the privilege of the Chief Justice of India to constitute benches to hear a case. So when a court case goes to the Supreme Court constitutes a bench. 3 judges bench, 5 judges bench, 7 or maybe 9 judges bench. So these many judges sit together to listen to that case. And in 2018, Supreme Court held that all the powers to constitute a bench lies with the Chief Justice of India. So whatever Chief Justice of India decides will be the member of a particular judge hearing a particular case. So according to the author, there is no doubt in the fact that Chief Justice must be the administrative head of the Supreme Court, but he must exercise his powers in a fair and a just manner. He must not constitute benches and allocate cases to those benches which tilts the balance in favor of executive. And according to the author, if we throw light on few of the important judgments given in past years, for example, Ayodhya case, Rafael case, Birla Sahara case, and the order for National Investigating Agency to probe into Hadia case, all have gone in the favor of executive. And on the other hand, the court so far has refused to decide on electoral bonds, removal of Article 370, various habeas corpus cases. So according to the author, it seems like creation of benches in the Supreme Court is being done in a manner which favors the executive. And to further bolster his point, the author says that various benches, all of which were headed by Justice Arun Mishra, who is now retired, were assigned as many as 8 cases dealing with Adani Group. So according to the author, since Chief Justice is now the master of the roster undisputedly, he decides who will look after which case, and that is why most cases belonging to Adani Group have gone to the benches headed by Justice Arun Mishra. Then role of various Chief Justices have come into question in past years, starting with Chief Justice J.S. Khehar's role. So former Arunachal Pradesh Chief Minister Kaliko Pul's wife requested an inquiry based on his suicide note. Chief Justice Khear and his colleagues stopped any such inquiry. Now compare this to Sushant Singh Rajput's case. In stark contrast, Supreme Court ordered an investigation by CBI into suicide of actor. And in that particular case, no suicide note was even found. Similarly, SC declined to order an inquiry into demise of Judge B.S. Loya, which was a much disputed matter back in 2016 and 17. Similarly, as far as Chief Justice Deepak Mishra is concerned, he presided over the Constitution bench hearing matters related to medical college scam. Even though the FIR named various unknown persons, the persons who were sitting at very important constitutional positions, and in the same case, various retired judges have also been charge-sheeted. Similarly, the matter of sexual harassment allegations against Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi. Soon after the sexual harassment charge against Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi were brought into limelight, Justice Arun Mishra and Justice Sanjeev Khanna presided over a bench to condemn the complainant. Then the matter of the functioning of the court during the period of lockdown has also been discussed by the author. Since the lockdown, Supreme Court has been functioning in a very truncated manner. Despite repeated requests from bar, virtual hearings are not being improved. Now, if you contrast this with the functioning of high courts, the high courts have been using better systems. Whereas Supreme Court persists on using a system which does not allow all the judges to sit every day. And as a result, generally 7-8 benches sit every day as against 13 to 15 which can be constituted right now. And hence, according to the author, the court needs to readdress its role assigned under the Constitution. The Supreme Court must reassert that it is truly the sentinel as regards the fundamental rights of all citizens. Invisible killer threatens country's sandalwood forest appears on page number 8. So the dreaded sandalwood spike disease has resurfaced, seriously infecting natural habitats in Karnataka and Kerala of sandalwood trees. And experts have warned that the disease has the potential to wipe out the entire population of the tree. So in this regard, from the perspective of prelims examination, let us just quickly discuss what sandalwood tree is and what this disease is all about. So sandalwood is a class of woods from the trees in the genus Santalum, which is not very important to keep in mind. That is why it is not written on the screen. What is important is that the woods of sandalwood are very aromatic and a very special oil is derived from the woods which are known as sandalwood oil. And this makes it one of the most expensive woods across the world. As far as the habitat is concerned, it is an evergreen tree. And now you have to find out which are the locations in our country where it is naturally found. If we talk about the threats to sandalwood, of course, anthropogenic illegal cutting is one of them. But apart from that, sandalwood is extremely sensitive to the forest fires. Apart from that, grazing by cattle, deer and other animals is also important threats. And since last 200 years, a disease known by the name of sandalwood spike disease has been a special cause of concern, which is caused because of bacteria. So direct question in the prelims examination can be asked with respect to identification of the pathogen which causes sandalwood spike disease, and that is a bacteria. Since few decades, this disease was under control, but in last year, scientists are reporting a lot of cases of this particular disease. And at present, there is no option but to cut down and remove the infected trees to prevent the spread of disease, and that is why it is extremely problematic. In the past also, this particular disease has led to cutting down of almost 1 million trees to prevent the wipeout of complete sandalwood population from India, and hence this disease should be taken very seriously. So a prominent politician, Mr. Jaswant Singh, has passed away. And in this regard, 2 news articles appear on page number 1 and page number 9. A soldier turned politician bids adieu, and diplomacy was Jaswant Singh's call to honor. And hence in this regard, let us discuss few points regarding life of Jaswant Singh. So before politician, he was a major in Indian Army. He was one of the founding members of Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP. And he was also one of the longest serving parliamentarian who continuously remained a member of parliament either of Lok Sabha or of Rajya Sabha from 1980 to 2014. So a period of 34 years consistently he was an MP. He held positions of Minister of Finance, Defence and External Affairs in the Union government, and few of the important tasks achieved by him for which he will be remembered are the post-Pokhran management of India's foreign policy. So just after India conducted nuclear tests in 1998, USA and Japan reacted very strongly and put a lot of sanctions, which were later on normalized within a period of 1 year, and major credit has been given to Mr. Jaswant Singh. Apart from that, he played a key role in the evacuation of Indians from hijacked Indian Airlines Flight 814 in 1999, which was taken to Kandahar. So these are the important aspects of the life of Mr. Jaswant Singh.